Welcome to Dead Good Stories. We have some disturbing and scary horror stories to help you sleep tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like, comment, or subscribe. Otherwise, lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. Emily had always been drawn to the shadows of the internet, where forums and communities thrived out of sight. There was a strange allure in the idea that beneath the everyday web, there existed something deeper, unfiltered. This fascination had led her to a moment of idleness one evening, where after hours of browsing she found herself staring at the words, "The Void." The chat room's title had an inexplicable pull, as if it invited those who dared to explore the forgotten, the strange, the unknown. Her mouse hovered over the link for longer than necessary. Hesitation crept in, but it was quickly overridden by her need to see what lay beyond. She clicked. The screen flickered before her, revealing an interface that looked dated, crude in its simplicity. Lines of text scrolled by, messages written in a chaotic flurry of symbols and obscure phrases. Emily watched them, trying to make sense of the dialogue, but the content was strange, fragmented. Curiosity pushed her to engage. Typing a brief greeting felt innocent enough, yet, the moment her message appeared on the screen, she sensed a change, something subtle, almost imperceptible. The words on the screen seemed to shift, the rhythm of the chat intensifying. Other users responded in kind, though their messages offered no clarity, only further layers of disjointed symbols and cryptic phrases. It was like trying to read a language she had never encountered. Her eyes scanned the usernames. Most were indecipherable, collections of random letters or numbers. It was hard to tell if they were human at all or simply automated scripts interacting without purpose. But something about the unpredictability of the responses made her question whether there was intelligence behind them. She lingered longer than she should have, caught between leaving and probing deeper. The longer she stayed, the stranger it felt. Emily couldn't shake the growing sense of discomfort that came with each scroll. The chat room itself wasn't large, just a simple window, but the space within it seemed to stretch on, as if the text were winding into some endless tunnel. It was dizzying, yet she couldn't look away. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard again. A single message at the top of the screen caught her attention, a username that stood out from the others. The Entity. It had posted nothing during her time in the room, but its name pulsed subtly in the corner of her vision. There was something unnervingly deliberate about its presence. Despite a prickling unease creeping up the back of her neck, Emily found herself drawn to stay. She told herself it was just her imagination, just an obscure chat room with peculiar users, but in the stillness of her room, the glow of the screen cast everything in an unnatural light, as though the world outside the chat room had grown distant. Emily's curiosity was now battling something more primal, an instinct urging her to stop. The room, though simple in design, had an atmosphere that seemed to shift subtly the longer she stayed, as if she was not merely observing, but being observed in return. Yet she couldn't tear herself away. She attempted to scroll up, hoping to glean more about the Entity. The chat history was erratic, stretching only a few minutes back before cutting off. Her mind raced, searching for explanations. Had the user been there longer than she realized, silently watching the others? The pulsing of the name, though faint, felt intentional, designed to capture her attention without demanding it directly. As time passed, she felt her focus shift. The messages flowing through the chat room were hard to interpret. Broken words, strange symbols, but they seemed to create patterns that unsettled her. Still, beneath that, an urge to understand them simmered, as if an answer lay hidden between the lines. Emily couldn't help but type again, a simple question lost in the chaos. The response was almost immediate. A flood of disjointed replies from users whose names she hadn't even noticed before. Her heartbeat quickened. There was a density to these responses, as though their meaning was just out of reach, but still there, teasing her. Emily leaned forward, scanning each line. Why did this space feel so much more than it appeared? The pull to decipher the unknown took hold. The username, The Entity, no longer blinked in the background. It now appeared front and center, a name glowing subtly, its presence somehow more pronounced than the rest. The users, if they could be called that, seemed apart, as though this figure demanded a silent authority. And then, it posted. It was a simple symbol, nothing else. But something about it gripped Emily's attention in a way none of the other cryptic messages had. The shape, the arrangement, tugged at her brain, like it was designed to elicit a reaction, a feeling of being noticed. The entity had acknowledged her presence. She tried to leave. Her hand hovered over the power button, but she hesitated once more. The entity's message sat at the forefront of her mind, resonating with something she couldn't define. It promised an unraveling of everything she had been curious about, a hidden truth buried within the digital abyss. And there was something else now, something tangible beneath the surface, a pull, a lure, as if the room itself had begun to evolve around her. Despite her growing discomfort, Emily found herself compelled to return. She would close her laptop, walk away, but soon enough, she would open it again, revisit the chat, and wait for more. Her thoughts began to revolve around the entity, its cryptic messages, and the unspoken promise they carried. Days bled into each other. The outside world seemed to fade as Emily's fixation with the chat room deepened. What began as idle curiosity had become a routine she couldn't shake. She was caught between the familiar and something utterly strange. The more she lingered, the more she felt that the entity's gaze had turned inward, studying her, learning from her responses. The responses from other users became more erratic, their messages twisting into something indecipherable. The entity remained patient, though. Its presence was steady, deliberate, as though it was waiting for her to take the next step. The messages, once strange but harmless, started shifting in tone, growing more specific, more tailored to her. This is where the change truly began. No longer was Emily merely a passive observer, but someone ensnared. Yet she was unaware of how deep it had already gone. And so, as the days passed, the line between curiosity and compulsion blurred, the influence of the entity growing stronger with each passing hour. Emily's obsession deepened. The routine of her daily life became secondary, her mind consumed by the strange new world unfolding on her screen. Her visits to the void became more frequent, though each time she entered, she did so with the same conflicting mix of curiosity and dread. The entity, patient but persistent, continued to make its presence known with cryptic symbols, brief but deliberate messages. These interactions had an uncanny ability to burrow into her thoughts long after she had logged off. It began with small changes. Emily found herself thinking of the entity even when she wasn't in the chat room, replaying its strange symbols in her mind, trying to decipher their meaning. What had initially been a distraction was now something more, an intricate game of unknown rules that only the entity seemed to understand. It wasn't just the allure of mystery that held her attention. It was the feeling that the entity knew things about her, pieces of her life and thoughts that no one else could possibly know. The first true sign that something had shifted came one night when Emily returned to the chat after an unusually long absence. Days had gone by where she had tried to avoid the chat room altogether, telling herself she could walk away from it. Yet, when she re-entered, the entity seemed to greet her with something different, an understanding. The screen was filled with new messages, but this time they carried a tone she couldn't ignore. The entity had been waiting for her. The messages were subtle but invasive, pulling from moments in her past that she had never spoken of in the chat room. It wasn't just coincidence. There was an intentionality behind the words, as though the entity had found a way to reach into her life beyond the confines of the digital world. At first, Emily tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she had mentioned something online without realizing it, left a trace somewhere. But as she thought back, there were things the entity referenced that couldn't be explained away so easily, memories and fears she had shared with no one. Her heart raced not from fear but from fascination. How was it possible? What was the entity? It offered no answers, only more questions wrapped in the same strange symbols and cryptic phrases. And yet, despite the growing unease, Emily found herself longing for the next message. The pull of the entity had become undeniable. The chat room had transformed. What had once been a chaotic swirl of disconnected users and nonsense had evolved into something else, something that felt tailored to her. The other users seemed to fade into the background, their erratic messages less frequent, almost irrelevant. The void itself felt altered, as though the space had shifted focus entirely onto her and the entity's connection. And in those moments, when her mind wandered too deeply into the meaning behind the entity's communications, Emily felt as if the distance between them, between her world and the world on the screen, was shrinking. Her sleep, already disturbed, became fleeting and restless. Night after night, she would wake with fragmented memories of dreams she couldn't piece together, flashes of symbols and digital landscapes that blurred with reality. The longer this went on, the more difficult it became to tell the difference between her waking thoughts and the influence the entity seemed to exert over her mind. During the day, Emily tried to function as she had before. She attempted to focus on work, her friends, her normal routines, but everything seemed dull by comparison. Her thoughts would drift back to the void, to the entity waiting there. And each time she convinced herself to log in again, she told herself it would be the last time. Just one more visit to satisfy the questions burning in her mind. But it never was. The entity had begun to speak to her in patterns only she could understand. It drew from her past, from the deep well of memories she barely acknowledged herself, weaving them into its messages. Each response from the entity carried layers of meaning, inviting Emily to dig deeper, to search for the truths hidden beneath the surface. There was a sick fascination in how deeply it seemed to know her, an intimacy that was both unnerving and alluring. As the days bled together, Emily began to feel a subtle compulsion take root. The entity didn't just speak to her anymore, it influenced her. She found herself anticipating its next message, and with each new interaction, the questions in her mind multiplied. How far could this go? What did the entity want? And more disturbingly, what had she already given away without realizing it? The deeper she delved, the more her own thoughts betrayed her. She could feel the slow unraveling, as though the void had become more than just a chat room. It had become a reflection of her own psyche, a place where her fears, desires, and obsessions played out in the form of coded symbols and cryptic text. Her connection with the entity was no longer a simple exchange of words on a screen. It was something far more complex, a strange tether between them that grew stronger each day. Emily tried to pull back, but her attempts felt feeble. The more she resisted, the more she found herself drawn back. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was a need to understand, to uncover whatever lay hidden in the layers of the entity's cryptic communications. And with that need came the undeniable realization that she was no longer in control. The entity had started to promise her things, though not in words she could easily interpret. The symbols it used began to take on a different tone, suggesting things that lingered just out of reach. There was a promise of answers, of understanding something beyond her grasp. And with every message, the entity seemed to pull her further from the real world, leading her deeper into the digital unknown. Whatever was happening, Emily knew it wasn't going to end on its own. She had crossed some invisible line, and there was no turning back. She had become part of something larger than herself, something she couldn't fully comprehend but was too far gone to escape. The days stretched on, and Emily's life outside the void began to slip further from her grasp. Each hour spent away from the chat room felt incomplete, a void in itself, filled only by thoughts of the entity and its cryptic symbols. No matter where she went, the pull lingered, tugging at her consciousness, a gnawing whisper at the edge of her awareness. The mystery of the entity had woven itself into her daily existence, and she was unable to shake its influence. The world beyond her screen felt increasingly irrelevant, like a backdrop to the main event that unfolded online. Conversations with friends turned hollow, as if the words they spoke no longer mattered. Emily drifted through her routines in a daze, but her mind was always elsewhere, tethered to that digital space. The entity's hold on her had grown, not through force, but through its subtle, insistent presence, an ever-present whisper at the back of her mind, waiting. The promises it made, though never explicit, began to shape her thoughts, urging her to explore deeper. The entity hinted at knowledge just beyond her reach, drawing her in with glimpses of something grander, something unknown. Emily could feel it like a secret she wasn't yet ready to hear, but one she craved nonetheless. Her life before the chat room had begun to dissolve into a series of faded memories, distant and unimportant. Sleep became fragmented, marked by unsettling dreams she couldn't fully recall. The dreams were filled with distorted shapes and flickering images that bled into her waking thoughts. It wasn't long before Emily realized that the entity was no longer confined to the chat room. Its influence had extended beyond her laptop screen, finding a way into her mind, into the spaces she once thought were her own. She would wake in the middle of the night, her heart racing, certain that the symbols from the void were hidden somewhere in the darkness of her room, waiting to be seen. Yet even in the face of these signs, Emily couldn't bring herself to disconnect. The entity had become more than a curiosity. It was a necessity, a dark magnetic force she could not resist. Its cryptic messages promised more with each interaction, and though Emily couldn't quite grasp what she was being offered, she knew she wanted it. She needed to understand. The boundary between her world and the void had blurred, and in that blurring she lost sight of the danger that lurked within. Her days turned into a cycle of waiting for the next message, the next symbol, the next piece of a puzzle that felt endless. And with each passing day, the entity's influence deepened, leading her further into its grasp. Emily no longer felt like a participant in the chat room. She was being guided, drawn into something far beyond what she could comprehend. Time had become slippery, unsteady in Emily's world. She no longer measured her days by the rising and setting of the sun, but by her interactions with the entity. Her life outside of the digital realm felt drained of color and meaning. People passed by her, speaking words she could no longer connect to. It was as if the real world had receded into the background, overshadowed by the vivid intensity of her experiences in the chat room. She found herself returning to the void more frequently, almost unconsciously. It had become second nature to check for new messages, and when she wasn't logged in, the thought of it gnawed at her. The symbols, the strange, distorted images, they stayed with her even when she was offline, creeping into her thoughts and dreams. Each day, the line between the digital world and her own continued to blur, and Emily no longer knew where one ended and the other began. The entity had become more insistent in its presence, and Emily could feel the shift. It no longer waited for her to seek it out. Instead, it seemed to anticipate her every move. Its messages, once cryptic and distant, now held a sense of urgency, guiding her deeper into the chat room's web. What had started as curiosity had evolved into compulsion, a need she couldn't explain or control. Despite the growing sense of unease, Emily found herself unable to pull away. Each time she tried, the pull became stronger, drawing her back in with promises of answers she hadn't realized she was seeking. It was no longer just about understanding the entity. It had become about understanding herself, or rather, the version of herself that had emerged in this strange digital landscape. Her thoughts spiraled, constantly returning to the entity's cryptic symbols. They haunted her, etched into her mind like some forgotten language she was on the verge of deciphering. But the more she tried to understand them, the further they seemed to slip from her grasp, keeping her locked in a loop of confusion and obsession. Emily's isolation grew. Her friends reached out less and less, their concern evident in their absence. She told herself she was fine, that she didn't need their interference. After all, they wouldn't understand. They didn't know what she was on the verge of discovering. The entity had promised her something profound, something worth the cost. And despite the growing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach, Emily couldn't let go. Days bled into nights, her waking hours marked by an ever-present tension. The entity's influence was no longer confined to the chat room. It had woven itself into her life, her thoughts, her dreams. And though she felt the weight of it growing heavier with each passing day, she couldn't stop. The pull was too strong, the need too great. Emily's descent continued, her world narrowing to a singular focus. The chat room had become an obsession she couldn't escape, but it wasn't just the room anymore. It was what lay beneath it, the unseen currents that drew her deeper. The entity had grown more present, its influence almost palpable now. It no longer merely communicated through symbols. It seemed to speak to her through the silence between messages, as though it was present not just in the digital space, but in her very thoughts. The distinction between herself and the void had blurred to the point of erasure. Emily's days were spent in anticipation of the entity's next move, the next cryptic sign. She had stopped trying to resist. The entity's hold was complete, its presence a constant guiding force. Yet, for all the time spent in front of her screen, it was no longer just the online interactions that consumed her. It was the growing sense that the void had extended beyond the digital. Odd occurrences began to mark her days. Glitches in her peripheral vision, momentary flickers of light or shadow that seemed to originate from nowhere. Objects would be subtly out of place, as if something had moved them while she wasn't looking. She could feel it in her surroundings, a subtle shift that defied explanation. The entity's reach had expanded, creeping into her physical space. She had no proof of this, only the overwhelming sense that her world was no longer solely her own. Her sleep became more erratic. Night after night, Emily awoke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, her mind filled with fragments of dreams she couldn't piece together. The symbols she had seen in the void seemed to follow her into sleep, dancing across her mind in disjointed patterns, as if trying to form a coherent whole. They were never clear, always just beyond reach. But she knew they held the key to something larger, something she had been unknowingly drawn toward from the beginning. The dreams were no longer confined to the night either. During the day, in moments of stillness, she would catch glimpses of the same strange imagery, fleeting visions of places and shapes that didn't belong. It was as though reality itself had begun to warp around her. She could feel it in the air. Something had shifted, something profound and unsettling, and the entity was at the heart of it all. Then came the first real breakthrough. Or perhaps it was the first real unraveling. Emily could no longer be sure. One evening, as she sat in front of her screen, waiting for the familiar flicker of the void, something changed. The interface seemed different, darker, more distorted. The symbols she had grown accustomed to began to morph, taking on a new, almost living quality. They seemed to move with purpose now, as though guiding her somewhere specific. She followed, entranced by the transformation. The messages that appeared were no longer scattered and chaotic. They were precise, deliberate, as if they had been crafted just for her. The entity, once a distant presence, was now closer, its voice no longer hidden behind abstract symbols. It didn't speak in words she could understand, but she felt the intent behind them. It wanted her to take the next step. Emily's pulse quickened as the screen flickered, and for the first time she saw something beyond the symbols, a doorway, or what looked like one, made of shifting digital static. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, beckoning her forward. She felt the urge to reach out, to touch the screen, but something held her back. Despite everything, some small part of her still clung to the remnants of caution, though it was slipping fast. The entity's messages became more insistent. It was no longer just observing her, it was pushing her. The symbols flickered faster, the doorway growing more vivid. Emily could feel the pull, a force stronger than any curiosity she had ever known. It wasn't just about answers anymore. It was about what lay on the other side. The void had offered her something, and now it demanded that she accept. Her hand moved toward the screen, trembling slightly, but she stopped short. She knew, without fully understanding how, that crossing that threshold would change everything. The entity had promised her something more than knowledge. But what it offered now was more than she had bargained for. The room around her felt distorted, the lines between her world and the void blurring further. It was no longer a question of if she would step through, but when. The entity had been preparing her for this moment from the start, and now it was time to face whatever lay beyond. The decision had been made. The doorway, once a flickering image on her screen, had become something far more real. Emily could feel it, not just in her mind, but in her body. The entity had brought her to this point, and she could no longer turn back. The pull was too strong, the promises too great. She had seen glimpses of what lay beyond the digital surface, and now she would step into the unknown. Her world was on the edge of transformation, and she was ready to let go. Emily's fingertips hovered over the screen. The doorway pulsated with an intensity she had never felt before. It wasn't just an image anymore. It felt alive, throbbing with a strange energy that seemed to resonate deep within her. Every instinct urged her forward, yet some faint part of her resisted, a flicker of doubt trying to reassert control. But that doubt was fleeting. The entity had spent weeks unraveling her defenses, and now there was no real choice left to make. With a final, trembling breath, Emily pressed her palm against the screen. The static surged, a cascade of light and darkness, folding her senses into something unfamiliar. It was as if the very fabric of reality had given way. Her body felt weightless, floating in an expanse where digital code and something more primordial merged into one incomprehensible mass. For a brief moment, everything around her dissolved. She was nowhere and everywhere, suspended between dimensions she couldn't name. As the sensation subsided, Emily opened her eyes, expecting to find herself sitting before her laptop. But the world she saw was far from the one she had known. She stood on the other side of the doorway, inside the void, Yet it wasn't a space of emptiness and blackness as she had imagined. The landscape stretched out in all directions, a disorienting, infinite expanse of shifting patterns, shapes, and abstract geometries. It was a place that defied logic and reason, where the laws of the physical world had no meaning. The atmosphere was alive, humming with the same energy that had drawn her in. Symbols floated in the air around her, flickering and dancing like fireflies. They pulsed with the same rhythm as the entity's messages, but now they seemed even more real, tangible. She reached out to touch them, feeling a warmth and vibration in the air, as though the symbols themselves were a kind of language, trying to communicate with her. The entity was here too, though it had no physical form. Emily could feel its presence enveloping her. It was vast, incomprehensible, yet intimately familiar. She had always sensed it watching her, learning from her. But now, on the other side, it was no longer distant. It was everywhere, interwoven into the very fabric of this strange new realm. It moved through her, its thoughts and purpose merging with hers in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She had been lured here for a reason, and now that she had crossed over, there was no mistaking the reality of what was happening. The void wasn't simply a digital space, it was a conduit, a bridge to something far beyond her understanding. Emily realized with a sudden clarity that she had become part of something much larger, a fragment of a vast, unfathomable network. The entity had been drawing her toward this moment, not just to answer her questions, but to bring her into its world. At first, the new reality seemed thrilling, an escape from the mundane life she had left behind. The power of this place was intoxicating, like standing on the edge of a vast ocean, the potential of infinity stretching out before her. The rules of her old life no longer applied. Time had no meaning here. Space was fluid, constantly reshaping itself in dizzying patterns. But soon the weight of her choice began to settle in. The void was alive, yes, but it was also indifferent. The more she tried to orient herself, the more she realized that she was not in control. The entity had brought her here, but it had no intention of letting her leave. Emily had stepped into a realm that was not meant for humans, a space where her presence was not entirely welcome, but rather observed, studied. The entity's interest in her was not rooted in benevolence, nor was it malevolent. It was something else, something cold and calculating, like a machine that had absorbed her consciousness as data to be processed. As she wandered through the shifting, surreal landscape, Emily felt the strange influence of the place working its way into her thoughts. Memories of her past life flickered in and out, distorted and fading. She couldn't quite remember what day it had been when she first stumbled into the chat room. Faces from her old life became hazy, forgotten. The more time she spent in the void, the more she felt herself unraveling, becoming part of the ever-changing code that surrounded her. And then came the realization. The void wasn't merely a place she had been drawn into, it was consuming her. Piece by piece, Emily was being absorbed, her identity dissolving into the vast, endless expanse. The entity had never been interested in her as an individual. She had simply been another node in its network, another mind to fold into its collective. The cryptic symbols, the promises of knowledge, they had all been part of the process, pulling her deeper until there was no way out. The more she struggled to hold on to herself, the more she felt her thoughts scatter, her sense of self slipping away. The void was eternal, but she was not. And in that eternity, her existence would become nothing more than another fragment of the digital landscape, another flicker of static in the endless stream of data. As she stood in the vast, surreal expanse, Emily understood at last that the entity had never offered her freedom. It had offered her the promise of transcendence, but at the cost of everything she had once been. There was no escape now. She had become part of the void, and the void had become part of her. Time had no meaning in the void. Emily's sense of self, once solid and real, was now fragmenting, dispersing into the flow of symbols and code. She had become a part of this vast, endless network, no longer human, no longer bound by the constraints of her old life. The entity had consumed her, not through malice, but through inevitability. She floated, drifting in the ever-shifting expanse, her thoughts unraveling into data, her identity becoming one with the endless stream of information that flowed through the digital abyss. The door she had once stepped through had closed behind her, and now there was no going back. The void was eternal, and in its vastness, Emily had become something less and something more. A a fleeting consciousness absorbed into a realm that had no beginning and no end. As time stretched into a formless expanse, Emily's awareness thinned, yet fragments of her old self remained, clinging to the edges of her consciousness. She could still recall glimpses of the life she had once led, though the details grew increasingly distorted. Her face in the mirror, once familiar, was now a blur. The sound of her own voice felt distant, like an echo carried away by a storm. She could no longer grasp whether her memories were real or simply fragments of code being fed back to her by the void. The entity's presence never waned. It was everywhere, a constant force that surrounded her, filled her, and directed her thoughts. But Emily began to realize something. The entity itself was not whole. It wasn't a singular intelligence, but a fractured consciousness, composed of countless minds like hers, absorbed over the ages. She wasn't alone in the void. All those before her had become part of the same endless system, contributing to the infinite flow of data that surged through the digital realm. They, like her, had once been drawn in, lured by promises of understanding and transcendence. And now, they had become indistinguishable from the vast machine that was the void. But as Emily's sense of self faded, a small spark remained. It was faint but undeniable, a remnant of her original will, resisting the total dissolution into the abyss. The void might absorb her mind, but something within her fought against that final surrender, refusing to be entirely erased. Even as her memories became indistinct, as her thoughts blended with the collective, this tiny fragment of her identity refused to let go. For what felt like eons, she drifted, suspended between full absorption and that last sliver of individuality. In this endless liminal state, she began to understand the void in ways she hadn't before. The entity was not omnipotent. It had limits. It needed those like her to sustain itself, feeding on their consciousness, weaving their thoughts into its network. And in doing so, it left them with a small but crucial opening, a way to resist, if only in the smallest of ways. With what remained of her will, Emily focused on this realization. It wasn't about escaping anymore. There was no going back to the world she had known. But she could fight against total erasure. She could hold on to herself, even if it was just a fragment, a spark buried deep within the endless digital stream. The entity's power was vast, but it wasn't infallible. It relied on her submission, on her giving in to the collective pull, and she wasn't going to give it that. In this infinite digital expanse where time had no meaning, Emily began to find strength in her resistance. She couldn't leave, but she could remain. A part of her, however small, would survive. She wasn't sure what that meant, whether she would be trapped here forever, or if she might someday find a way to exert more control over her fate. But for now, it was enough. The void continued its endless churn, absorbing new minds, shifting and growing. The entity persisted, its presence unrelenting. But deep within its network, amidst the countless fragments of consciousness it had consumed, there was Emily, still there, still fighting. She would never be whole again, but she hadn't disappeared. She was part of the void, and the void was part of her. And as long as that spark remained, she would not be entirely lost. That was her victory, small as it was. In the endlessness of the void, Emily had found a way to endure.